And this is working the other way. We have a graph. Can we write the equation? So in the same way that we graph it, we kind of work backwards from that and say, can we look at this and can we tell what the center line is? Can we tell what the amplitude is? And if we know the period, can we work backwards to find our b value? So when finding the center line, there's a couple of different things that you can do. You can sort of try to eyeball it and say, oh, I think it looks like it's right here. And if you count how many blocks do we go up from there to my maximum, it's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. Yes, I have counted the right spot. So I could try to guess, just like that, to figure out my center line and say, I figured out that my center line was at 1, so that means my d value is going to be 1. Now, if you don't like guessing, because sometimes you can guess and guess and guess and guess and not get the right answer over and over and over again, well, your center line is right between your maximum and your minimum. And anytime you're trying to find a number right between something, that's like an average. If you got 80 on one test and 70 on another test, what's your average going to be? 75, the number right in between. How do you figure out an average? Like 80 and 70, it was pretty easy to figure out 75, but if I told you got 62 on one test and 77 on the other test, how would you figure out the average? You just add them up and then divide by 2. So you could do that as well with your center line, because your center line is an average. What's my maximum? My maximum's at 6. What's my minimum? -4. If I add those up and divide by 2, I get 1. So it's another way of helping us find that center line. Once you find that center line, and I'll just draw it in and label it. Once I found that center line, what's my amplitude going to be? 5, because from my center line to my maximum, it's going to be 5. Okay? Sometimes people also use their max and their min to find their amplitude. If you find the distance between your max and your min, does that make sense that that's always 2 amplitudes? If you wanted to find the distance between numbers, for example, how far apart are 7 and 2? 5. That's easy because both of them were positive numbers, right? But what did you do? You just subtracted 7 minus 2 to get 5. Now that I have some negative numbers, it's the same idea. If I want to figure out what's the distance between 6 and -4, I just have to subtract, but subtracting a negative will give me that there's a distance of 10 between them, so my amplitude is going to be half of that. My amplitude is going to be 5. So we got our D, we got our A value. Our B value came from, right, we could figure out our period because our period was always 2 pi over our B value. So we had this formula. Our period was equal to 2 pi divided by our B value. If you want to rearrange this formula so that B was by itself, B would equal 2 pi. Well, you'd have to multiply both sides by B and then divide both sides by the period. Your B value is going to be 2 pi divided by your period. So how do we figure out how long the period is for this graph? Well, you can choose any point. Say you choose your minimum. The period will be how long it takes to get back to that minimum. If I'm just counting squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares to get across. How much is 1 square on this graph? One square is not 1 because 2 squares is pi over 6. 1 square would be pi over 12. So my period is equal to 8 of those, or 8 pi over 12. So if I want to figure out what my B value is, I'm going to have to say, well, my b value is 2 pi divided by my period, which is 8 pi over 12. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. Your pi's will cancel out. 2 times 12 is 24. Divide by 8 is equal to 3. And then your c value is your starting point. In this question, it said to write your question in terms of sign. So then we have to ask ourselves, where does sine normally start? Sine normally starts in the middle, going up. Where does that happen? Right here. So in order to get that, I'm going to have to shift 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, which is the same as pi over 4. I'm going to have to shift pi over 4 to the right. Well, how do I put all of that information into my equation? I've got my a, my b, my c, and my d values. I can now write my equation. Y will equal, amplitude is 5, sine, b value is 3. Factored out, I need a shift of pi over 4 to the right, so that'll be minus pi over 4. And my d value is plus 1. Sometimes on a final exam, it'll say write 2 equations, one in terms of sine and one in terms of cosine. So if you had to write an equation in terms of cosine, notice the d value, the a value, and the b value. The dab part doesn't matter if it's a sine graph or a cosine graph. You still have the same period, the same amplitude, and the same center line. The only thing that changes from a sine graph to a cosine graph is where it starts. So where does a cos graph normally start? At a maximum. There we have our maximum. It's another shift. How many? Well, if I count squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's been shifted 5 pi over 12 to the right. So how do I write that equation for my cos graph? Amplitude stays the same. B value stays the same. But now my shift is 5 pi over 12 to the right. My d value stays the same. So we could have written a cos equation. If you say the sine graph starts in the middle going up, can you see you could have used that one as well? That would give you a different c value, but the same equation. And it wouldn't be wrong. What happens if I use that value as my starting point? If it's in the middle going down, it would be a negative sine graph. So then you would have a negative 5 at the start. Same thing, you could start with this one. Whoa, those are dots. There we go. You could start with that one, a minimum. And that minimum would be a negative cos graph. So there's a bunch of different right answers for this. There's not just one right answer. Often I think they try to pick whatever's closest to the x-axis. So for this one, if they were choosing a cos graph, they might start with a negative cos graph because it's just a shift of pi over 2 to the right. Or if they started with a sine graph, they might start with a negative sine graph that's just been shifted pi over 2 to the left. So if you want some practice with these ones, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And tomorrow's class, we'll get some more practice with these graphing questions.